So for the rest of today's session, we're going to focus on a series of business cases that we've built out with customers across the world, using some of these technologies and the vendors and so on, and applying them to help you think about what you might do in your organization. I'll remind you as we do that, our approach to building out these solutions is to use that both ends into the middle. So in every case, we're going to introduce it by talking a bit about the business case. We'll talk about the data sources that we're using and then how we bring all of that together to improve the way that decisions are made in the organizations that we work with. So in the first scenario, I'm going to talk about something that we've been working on with a medical devices company. We've been working on it kind of across use cases, but specifically the first one that we picked out was product portfolio management. So I'll use that to introduce it today. And there are a couple of reasons that product portfolio management is really particularly interesting in a medical devices company. The first is that there's a constant innovation of products. And as you're innovating and releasing new products, so your product list is growing. If you let it grow forever, that becomes more complex for sellers, for manufacturing, for customers. And so you need to manage that list of products and actively think about what you're selling at any point in time. Second aspect, anytime you're making a new release after you've innovated a product, there are various different strands that need to be brought together. So you're thinking about the manufacturing process and getting the manufacturing right. You're thinking about getting the selling in line with that. Also for medical devices, there's a regulatory component. Anywhere that you want to release it, you need to get that all aligned, ideally to the same timeline. And then you need to be thinking about the healthcare providers, the end users of the device, like how are they getting trained up and having them trained on the right timeline. So getting all of those things running in the same timeline is really important. Another complexity comes from different consumption patterns for different products. In some sense, I think that happens in a lot of organizations, but to give one example of it here, capital equipment versus consumables. So you could be thinking about larger machines that might be bought once or twice by each hospital versus consumables then that are used every time there's a different procedure. Those have very different sales patterns and very different product life cycles. So you need to think about those differently when you're managing your product portfolio as well. Within all of that, you need to think about forecasting. And I think at some level, some of that is going to be manual at every stage, but there are places that we can start to bring in machine learning, AI to help with the forecasting. But more than that, forecasting is important because when we think about potentially delisting a product, for example, that's not something that can be done quickly. So we need to be making that decision well ahead of time so that the plan can be laid out. You make sure there are replacement products. If there's training or work that needs to be done to kind of cross over between two products, that needs to be done really far in advance. So you need to be thinking about the data and thinking about what's happening to the product, say a year out, a year and a half out, not just what's happening today. So then we started looking at how we could improve the access to data for the regional leadership team. And as the regional leadership team are considering their product portfolio, there are a few really important things for them to be thinking about. One is they really want to base the strategies on the data that's available. And in this scenario, the customer had already worked to get their data platform in place, get the right data in. And so they had access to good quality, trusted data in that sense. But we were trying to help them bring that to the fore in the regional leadership team meetings. Second, you need cross-functional alignment. As you can imagine, that kind of leadership team, there are people coming from different functions within the business. And to give one example, something like the date on which a product is used might be viewed differently by different functions in an organization. So the sales team might use the invoice date. Regulatory and compliance might be interested in the actual procedure date. Manufacturing are probably interested in the delivery date. But when you're talking in a leadership team meeting, you want to have that alignment across all the different functions. So we need to define, like, when we're talking about product lifecycle development, which of those dates are we using in any particular context? Obviously, the view needs to be up to date and timely. But to give an example of why that's a challenge, if a question is asked in a leadership meeting before we started putting this solution in place, one of the challenges, if a question comes up, maybe there's a dashboard for that, but probably no one in the leadership team knows where that dashboard is. Or if they do, they've got to go and fetch it and bring it up. More likely, in some cases at least, you're asking people to go and ad hoc look up the data, do an analysis, and bring the data back. And that takes a period of time. That takes you out of the flow of the meeting. At the very least, often it's meaning that decisions are having to be taken based on what information is available at the time. And throughout all of this, trust in the data is key. Trust in the data in the sense of knowing that the data is accurate, but also knowing how we've analyzed the data and any numbers that we're reporting. It's really important that we know where those have come from and how they work. So these were some of the things that we had to think about as we were thinking about how do we use AI to help that leadership team see the data, use the data more effectively. So to give you an example of just a couple of questions and help you think about how this might work in a meeting, I've changed up the example from what we did with the customer, but this gives you the idea. One question, how many cochlear implants have we sold in France since the start of the year? You can imagine you'd then be going up and looking up a sales database or whatever, trying to find those numbers. Also things like, when do we expect the improved version of a particular product to be approved for release? And these questions are typically asked in the flow of the meeting. So it's very important to us as we're thinking about applying AI, how can we help the regional leadership team to stay in the meeting flow, get the answers to their questions and continue their discussions and move on so that they're setting their strategy in a timely manner. Easiest way for me to show you what we came up with is to show you a demo of a solution based on all the same technologies, all the same approach, and a few things to look out for as I show it. The first is voice interaction with the data. That was really important because when we were thinking about the leadership meetings, we want to stay in the flow of the meeting. If you're typing something in, that's one person going to the laptop and then kind of reading out the response. When it comes to a leadership meeting, we want them to be able to ask the question and the response to come back to everyone in the room, maybe using it on a big screen, but at least getting the voice interaction with it. Also, flexible interaction in natural language. You don't want someone to have to stop and think, right, okay, what's the database table? Or even what is the specific name of the metric we're using? We want this to interact in a way that's very natural. And then we're bringing in contextual dashboards. So much of the information that we look at, it's not just a point in time number. That number sits in a wider context that is really useful to present and understand what we're looking at. And then throughout this, we're using customized controlled analysis paths. Like I say, trust in the data is key. Trust in the analysis is key. So for us to be able to control how this is analyzing the data was really important for us as well. A final note before I go into the demo, we're not showing the real data from the customer. So this is a replacement data set. So if it doesn't look like medical devices, I apologize, but it is giving the same flavor and flow of how things would work. So with that, let me switch into the browser and show you what this looks like. Show me the sales overview for 2024. Always a nervous wait while it does the first one. It takes slightly longer for the first question while it wakes up.
The total sales value for all countries in 2024 is 139.06 billion euros. For more information, please refer to the report on the right.
So you can see by asking a question in natural language, it's giving me an answer directly in the chat panel. So if we want to bring back a single number, we can do that. While on the right-hand side, we've got a dashboard. Here, I'm showing you Power BI in the case with the customer. We had some dashboards in Power BI, some in Tableau. And one of the great things about that is we can use existing dashboards where they exist. So like I say, the company had a really great data platform already. There are some dashboards in place, and certainly going forward, we're thinking about how we make more use of what exists as part of that. Let me continue here. Show me the year-on-year sales growth.
For which year would you want to look at?
Okay, so there I asked a question. I forgot to specify one of the parameters. I forgot to give it the year, and it's coming back and asking me which year do you want to look at. Now, the reality is we can specify defaults for some of the parameters. So actually something like a year, we're most likely to set it to the most recent year. But maybe in some cases you need a product to be specified and there isn't an obvious default. we can have the model come back and ask for specific input. The other thing you might have noticed is that I typed that in, and so when it gave me a response back, it didn't read the response out. So if I use text, I can do this quietly in the background and just check something quickly without interrupting everyone else. Show me the sales overview for Austria in 2024. See if it copes with my accent here.
The total sales value for Austria in 2024 is 13.22 billion euros. For more information, please refer to the report on the right.
So for the eagle-eyed among you, you might notice that this is the same dashboard as I showed in the first question. The thing that's changed this time is specifically we're looking at Austria. We flag that to the user at the top of the dashboard, and I'm able to look at the specific information that I want to look at in this context. I'll flag as well, like this is a dashboard, this is Power BI dashboard, and we can interact with it as we normally would. So throughout this, I can click, I can use drop-downs, filters, whatever way you usually would in a dashboard. And if I want to go and see the original, there's a button to click and go and see the actual report in the context of the set of dashboards that it was originally in. Now let me show a couple of questions that are specifically related to the product portfolio management. What are the top 10 products in Austria?
Your report is now ready to be reviewed.
And so here we're going to show the list of top 10 products in Austria alongside some of the context in that dashboard. I'll ask a subtly different question now. What are the 10 most profitable products in Austria?
Your report is now ready to be reviewed.
So this is an example of where we're really customizing some of the analysis paths here. When someone doesn't specify what they want to analyze by, we're able to set the default that we want for our organization, the context that people would use. And that's something that we've discussed with different users in the business to understand what is it they would expect to see as the default there. But if I want to go more specific, I can specify profitable products or most profitable products, and then it's going to bring up a dashboard that's specifically related to that. And in this case, you can see in the chart on the right, for example, we're looking at cost of goods sold versus average selling price, which for this organization, when they're looking at profitable products, that's the way they're calculating the kind of the default profit measure that we're using here. One final example of a more complex analysis that we've customized here. What is the impact if we increase sales for the top 10 products by 50%?
Your report is now ready to be reviewed.
So again here, this is an analysis that we've customized. There are different ways you could do this. When you talk about a 50% uplift, do you increase everything by 50% across all months? Do you apply more in months with certain seasonality patterns to them? And this is all analysis that we're customizing behind the scenes. So rather than just leaving it to a large language model to decide what it wants to do on its own, the approach we're using has very specified analysis paths that means that every time we know the answers that it's going to give back. So with that, I'll switch back into the presentation just to talk a little bit more about the way that this works. So how is it doing what it does? When a user comes to the system, the first thing they do is they type the question or they ask the question in that chat interface. We're then passing it to an AI agent, and this is the tool really that's doing all of the work of taking the user question and figuring out what to do with it. There are a couple of different things that AI agent can do. One is looking up a particular query function. That's in most cases a SQL query that we've already written. It can be more customized. It's taking in some of the parameters that the user specified, but we're using a customized analysis path that we control. And that's going back against the data lake that the customer's already built up and built some really trusted data in. Alongside that, the AI agent has a knowledge of which dashboards are related to which questions. And so it can look up which dashboard to display, show that to the user in the front end, and that dashboard is running on that same data set in the data lake, so that when we're answering a question in the chat panel versus when they're seeing it in the dashboard, we want to make sure that it's giving the same answer back. So we're using the same data source for both. So like I say, it's the AI agent really here that's allowing us to do that matching from natural language into how the solution answers the question. And that is an AI agent that for that AI agent, we've used Amazon Lex as the tool. The customer is using AWS as their platform, and Amazon Lex is a tool within that allows you to do that kind of matching of a natural language question to the action that you want to take. This is from the AWS website. They basically describe it as being like the AWS tool that's equivalent to Amazon Alexa. So those of you who are familiar to using that, it's giving something of a familiar approach. In our case, though, we're able to connect it specifically to the analysis paths that we have in the organization. How is it doing that? From our input question, I'll take the example, show me an overview of sales in Europe. We then match that to one of a list of intents that we pre-specified, called intents within the tool. So in this case, it might go to sales overview. Each of those intents has a set of what are called slots. Think of those as parameters to a function or whatever, if that helps. So in this case, it's picking up Europe as the geography, or I could specify other countries or other regions, and that will change the response that comes back. To give another example, what are the top 20 products being sold in France by sales volume? Top end products is the intent in that case, and we've got a series of slots. In this case, like I say, you can have a default, so it's picking up the SKU level maybe as a default for that question. And then one final example, what would happen to the margin if we increased sales of cochlear implants by 30%? That'll run a what-if analysis by product, and it can pick up various different parameters from the way the user asks the question. The final part of the process for us then, in terms of getting Lex to work, is we specify a list of utterances. So for each of the intents that we specify, we give it some examples of how the user could phrase the question. And this isn't an exhaustive list of all the ways they could phrase it, it's some examples. And if you can see on the screen there, there's examples where we put kind of the slot placeholders, and Lex will allow you to kind of fill in the gaps there. So we give it some examples, it will then pick up on all the different options. So when a user asks a question, it then identifies which of the intents is best matched to that and answers the question following that. So why are we using this approach? What are some of the advantages of the approach that we've taken here? Well, it's making the data available as you ask the questions. So it's quick to get access to the dashboards, it's quick to get access to the responses in the chat panel, and it makes the data available as you're having the conversation. So improved speed of access is key. As I've talked about a couple of times now, control was really important for us here in controlling how the data is presented. A couple of things to that. One is that we control the analysis paths. The second is that we're recording the questions and the responses. So if anyone's questioning it later on, we can always go back and see exactly what happened. How was their question interpreted? How was it answered? And if we do need to make changes, we can see exactly what changes need to be made. And we're thinking about how to go beyond just that product portfolio analysis into things like showing more data from the P&L and other types of analysis that we can show within this context. One conversation that's come up a few times as we've been building this, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about at this point, is when is it useful to take this kind of bespoke approach versus when should you be looking at some of the packaged AI tools that are available? And I've put on the screen ChatGPT and Copilot that I'm sure most people are familiar with. Maybe a less famous one, but relevant in this context, given we're in the AWS platform, is Amazon Q, which is probably their default tool. And there are a couple of reasons that we've gone bespoke rather than using these tools. Certainly out of the box, these tools don't have access to your enterprise data. So that's one big reason. There are ways to connect some of these tools up to your data and use them in particular ways. The thing that I would say is really important to us as we built this bespoke is to have that customization, so that when someone's asking a question, very often if our leaders are asking a question, they don't know the number that's the answer, but they know roughly how they want it to be calculated, or at least at the organizational level, there are expectations around how things should be calculated. And by building bespoke, it gives us that level of control. We're also able to set up how we want the things like the auditing, monitoring, and decide how we want to handle all of that. And so going bespoke just gives us a level more control than we would have had if we'd used some of those packaged approaches. And in doing that bespoke, there are a few things that we've tailored. First, we're able to make use of the existing data. And as I mentioned earlier, we can use some of the existing dashboards as well and are likely to going forward. We're keeping it reliable, traceable, and auditable. We're building all of that into the tool. and the custom analysis paths really help with that. We're thinking about how we roll it out to different users, different analysis paths, and even bringing in more data sets as we go forward to help with that, and scaling to new intents and data sets over time.